Welcome to the Courageous Caribbean Woman podcast. I'm your host, Fralene Wilkins. Join me in this interview with a fellow Caribbean woman as we motivate and inspire you to unleash your own courage. Let's go. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Courageous Caribbean Woman podcast. Today, I am joined by Mrs. Summer Edwards Williams, and I'm so happy to have her here with me today. She's from the lovely island of Trinidad and Tobago. She's a Christian life and trauma coach, and she's also an author of several books, some of which are Fighting Your Goliaths, My Healing Journey Journal, It's a Soul Issue, and 7 Days to Make a Difference. She's a mother of three, the founder of Fresh Oil Ministries in Trinidad. She also has a non-profit organization, the She Foundation of Trinidad and Tobago, and she's also a wife. Thank you so much for joining us today, Summer.
Thank you so much, Fralene, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here this evening with you.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, usually I like to start these conversations with some of my favorite questions, just so
Sure.
that the listeners can get to know you a bit better, right? And so, would you describe yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
I would say I'm ambivert. I'm both.
Okay, okay.
I'm both. There are times where I enjoy being alone and I
Mm-hmm.
have to make up my mind, mentally prepare myself to entertain others. And there are times where I can just be outlandish and loud and, free spirited. So I'm a mixture of both.
Got it. I like that. Good. And what do you enjoy doing in your downtime?
To be quite honest, I'm always working on the next thing. So in my
Mhm.
downtime, it's like it's valuable time. It's time to plan something. My mind is always going. So in my downtime, I'm always preparing for the next thing.
Right. Okay. Good. What is the thing that you would say that you love about your job?
The impact I have on students and clients.
Okay.
I think that, that level of transparency that I value helps many I become relatable
Mm-hmm.
and many are given hope. And for me, that is the major thing, the impact and the influence and the igniting of purpose when we exchange in conversation. Actually, that's my motto: impacting lives and influencing decisions and igniting purpose. I do exactly that in every sphere that I'm in.
I love that. Um, which is, I will probably get into that later on around that whole
Yes.
conversation of purpose, because that comes up quite a bit now, or maybe just among millennials or something. But anyway, if you had the power to go back to the past and make some changes there, or go to the future, which one would you pick and why?
I'll choose going to the future because I
Mhm.
believe the things of my past has prepared me for the future. I believe
Right.
that the things of my past has built a part of who I am that is necessary for the future. So I don't think I want to go back to the past. I mean, as hurtful as some of the past was, it was also the tools that activated my purpose. And so the future will always be the option for me.
Okay, good. And finally, this is actually a new one, right? So you're the first guest. I decided to switch something out, right? What activity should a visitor to Trinidad and Tobago put on their itinerary?
I think touring the country, particularly tourist attraction sites. One for me, I love the Pitch Lake. I'm
Okay.
enthused by the Pitch Lake,
Okay.
particularly the history, the rich history behind it, and
Mhm.
how amazing you see nature for what it is, and
Right.
the value of the resource of the pitch that we have. I believe it's number one, if not in the world or the Caribbean. So
Yeah.
I believe it's quite valuable. It's something that we take for granted here in Trinidad. But I would advise anybody to go. Just putting your foot in the pitch lake and walking, and it's a different experience.
Yeah. It's actually somewhere I've never gone to. So I'll just note that even for myself to take the opportunity to go there sometime. So thanks for that.
Nice.
Okay, great. And so now we're talking about trauma, right? And recently I was having a conversation, um, and I was explaining to the person basically, hey, sometimes we miss like what trauma is, right? So because we
Yes.
sometimes think it's like really big things or only big things,
Mhm.
I should say. Right.
Yes.
And so I want us to kind of get into that, right? As we talk around recovering and not just recovering, but flourishing, after trauma.
Yes.
But before we get to that, tell us a little bit about how it is you ended up in the job that you're doing.
Um, to be quite honest, it's not something I thought of. My heart's desire as a child was to be a nurse.
Okay.
Outside of being a nurse, I wanted to be a teacher, in which I became, and still operate in the education system. However, while I was in college many moons ago, I found myself in situations whereby I was always in a leadership capacity, but I was also in a capacity always sharing my story.
Mhm.
And I would have experienced quite a bit of trauma in my life from childhood to my adulthood. And as a tool, God will always send people my way, and I will always be led to share my story and how I overcame. And I began to develop strategies and techniques that I made notes and worksheets and workbooks. And I was like, why am I doing this? And it was only 3 years ago that when I lost my mother in 2020, the Lord spoke to me very clearly about going to spaces where I would, speak on trauma. I had no,
Mhm.
that was my background. My studies
Yeah.
was in hospitality management and business.
Mhm.
And then I went on to my master's in clinical psychology and now pursuing my PhD in clinical psychology. But I love it
Okay.
in terms
Excellent.
of trauma.
Excellent.
So that's how
I
I end
love
up
that.
there.
Good. That's lovely. Sometimes things don't always go the way that we, assume or the way that we were thinking. And that's quite similar for me as well. Like I had this path for myself to become a doctor and all of this kind of stuff. And like you, I say, hey, God said, hey, psychology, go there. And I was like, cool.
Yes. Yeah.
So, so that's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, good. You mentioned that, you had to deal with quite a bit of trauma, right? And it's all
Yes.
part of your story and even the work that
Yes.
you do. What would you say are some of the things that you did to overcome your trauma?
I believe the first thing is to be honest with yourself.
Hmm.
Be honest about the things that happened to you. Be honest about even the fear that you have of people knowing.
Hmm.
There's an acronym that I have for trauma in order to overcome, and the
Yeah.
acronym HEAL.
Yeah.
H, be honest. Be honest about the situation, be honest of how you feel, your emotions. E, have expectations. If you want to be healed, you have to expect that healing will take place. You can't just decide, well, I want to be healed, but not expect it. You also have to admit to what has happened, and also if there is a participatory role you played in that
Mhm.
traumatic event, own it. Because some of the traumas that we experience is based on decisions that we made. It's not always that something would have happened to us. Yeah.
Right. Hmm.
Admit and seek advice. Admit an advisory capacity. Who can you get help from, and apply the counsel that you get. Of course, you will not go to any and everybody,
Hmm.
but there are those that I believe that are well equipped, like myself,
Yes.
a coach, a psychologist, or whatnot that can help you to overcome. And let it go. We hold on to things a lot, and we believe that holding on to it will help us to heal. It wouldn't. And so, one of the things I like to ensure is that we have the power to bounce back. There's resilience
Hmm.
inside of us, but we
Hmm.
have to let it go and understand that we can't go back, but we can only move forward. And so that's how I overcame. I began to be very open about it. things that happened to me. I was raped. I was molested as a child. I was in abusive relationships. I did things. I made poor decisions as a result of what happened to me. I was vulnerable, very promiscuous at a certain point in time in my life. And all of those things had consequences that were traumatic. And so, as a result of that, I had to stop hiding because I always appeared to be a very strong woman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's because I was forced to be strong from the age of 10 when my father left home. And so the perception, and I grew up with that wall of being strong and I could do it for myself. And, I led with grace and I led well, but I was broken and empty on the inside. And I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. There were nights I would be crying and talking to God, and I can't deal with this anymore. And I'm there, and why did I do it? And I'm just there beating up myself until I said, listen, I had enough. And then I had an emotional discharge where I released every emotion that was there, and that came in the form of a book. It came in platforms, it came in conversations, small groups of women, my colleagues, and I began to speak. I began to open up. And the more that I opened up, while there was ridicule, there was also hope and support. And so that was my strategy in moving or getting over or recovering from the traumatic events that happened in my life. And I found help. I went for help.
Yeah. Yeah.
I didn't keep it a secret anymore. I needed help. So I went where I could get help. And of course, sometimes you may have a perceived notion or a perception of what help looks like. Sometimes help comes in the form where you least expect it. The common man, the ordinary man, but then there's also the professionals who can help you. And then journaling. That's a strategy too. I wrote everything, and that birthed my books and the books that are coming. So that was how I dealt with
Yeah. That so many nuggets there that I kind of want to um jump on. Even just starting with the acronym HEAL, to just go with that again.
Sure.
You mentioned being honest.
Honest, yes. Be
You
honest
mentioned
about the situation, how you feel, if you
mm-hmm.
had a part to play in it, and
Right.
everything that has to deal with the traumatic event, be honest about it, acknowledging it. Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Yes.
expectations. You have to
Expectations.
expect that you will be
Mm-hmm.
healed, expect that healing is happening, expect that you will go through the healing process and see a healed version of yourself.
Yeah.
Admit.
Mm-hmm.
You have to admit that you need help. You also have to, accept or acknowledge that it has happened. And you also have to apply the counsel that you would seek after for help.
Mm-hmm.
And L, let it go.
Yeah.
You have to be able to let it go. And I was just explaining that we have resilience. We have a mind that is so powerful, that is very much underutilized, that allows us to let go of things.
Yeah. Good. Absolutely agree. And they all make so much sense. If you're not honest about what has happened to you, then you won't actually get help, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that first point, I mean, is just where we just need to start even. And
Yes.
the expectation bit there, I absolutely love that because I think if it is that you don't expect that things will change or you can overcome, then that's not an experience that you're going to have, right? And
Yes.
of course, um, seeking the advice, the advisory part that you mentioned, and even the acknowledging things and as well letting go. Letting go is
Yes.
super duper important,
Important.
right?
Yeah.
It's very important. Okay, good. So that's some of what you said in the initially there, and then you mentioned journaling. Now, people who already listen know that I'm a huge fan of journaling.
Yes.
Recently, I heard somebody say that, believe it or not, or of course, people might disagree with this, but language can replace action. So what it would basically trying to say is when we have emotions, when we're able to put words to it, it helps
Yes,
in terms of having things flow, right?
of
And
course.
right. And so that you're not going to respond in an emotional way to the things that happen to you.
Correct.
I just realized though, we didn't talk about what trauma is. So can you tell us a bit about what is trauma?
Trauma is the psychological response to anything that has caused you to be emotionally dysregulated. And what does that mean? It means that anything that would have caused you to be fearful, angry, sorrowful, um, disappointed, have anxious responses or anxiety. Trauma is any event that shakes up your emotions. And it can be categorized in big T and small t. What does that
Mhm.
mean? Or it could be in three ways: acute, chronic, or complex. That means you have the one-off traumatic events. You're driving, you crash into a dustpan, a dustbin, and you get fearful and you don't want to drive again. That's acute trauma. It happened once. Then you have the big T, or the complex and the chronic trauma, whereby, if you're a child and you're continuously being abused, or you have intimate partner violence, those things, and it is continuous, that those things fall under big T, or complex or chronic trauma. Then you have trauma that if it is continuous and not addressed, then it hinges itself to mental health issues or
Shoes.
mental illnesses.
Mm.
So that's basically what trauma is. It is not only the big events like a freak accident or rape victim. Trauma could be gang violence, societal trauma, you have generational trauma, you have just witnessing something. If you have parents who were abusive to each other, that would have been traumatic. You're in a classroom and a teacher embarrasses you. That's a traumatic event. So trauma, one of the things that I love about what I do is the psychoeducation part of it, because I merge psychoeducation, biblical principles, as well as coaching strategies. So we understand what happens to the traumatized brain, and we understand exactly what trauma is. And it is individual. We could grow up in the same household, witness the same events, and it impacts us differently. My siblings might tell a different story to myself. Having my father left home, my mother, being on her own, and how it affected me was different to how it affected them. It does not mean that it was not traumatic for me. So it's individual, and it's a psychological response to anything that would have, or any event that would have caused your emotions to be dysregulated.
Okay, good. So we're hearing that you mentioned big T trauma, little T trauma, and the different types, and also that emotional dysregulation. What does
Yes,
that look like?
that looks like fear,
Mm.
anxiety, your heart always racing, expecting the worst. That looks like dissociation. You don't want to be a part of anything or anyone. You're fearful of abandonment, so you pull away because of that traumatic event. That looks like anger and rage. It also looks like, um, you know, aggression, and sometimes silence. There are some people, they go into a numbing stage where they're just numb. They're numb, no emotions whatsoever. And that's because trauma has caused them to be silenced or dissociated. It also looks like dismissing your reality. So there are some people develop an entire lifestyle and personality that is opposite to what they would have had. You would have never thought that they would have had any kind of trauma in their lives, because they developed a personality and an entire lifestyle that is totally made up so
Mm.
that they can forget the trauma. And that is a level of dissociation or emotional dissociation as a result of a traumatic experience.
Good. All right. And so of course, what I'm hearing is a lot of the emotions and the things that we kind of say, just by the way, because generally a
Yes,
lot of people talk about feeling anxious or fearful or even depressed, right?
yes.
Um, a lot of these things now are connected then to trauma.
To trauma, yes. And also, if I should add, sometimes you cannot even pinpoint the emotion because trauma can also be, you don't always get a picture of that traumatic event, but your body responds because your nervous system and your body is responding to that event. So you may not remember. You may not remember even in chronological order what exactly happened, but your nervous system responds. So you might feel fear but don't know what it is, or you might feel anger and don't know what it is because your nervous system, you have no control over that.
Right. Yeah. So which is just the beauty of the mind, right? Previously,
Yes.
just now you were mentioning how you bring in that psychoeducation bit with the Christian principles, right? As well
Mhm.
as the coaching techniques and so on. Um, and you emphasize understanding, which means really critical, right? And because
Yes.
it's in understanding then that you will be able to make the change, right?
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
let me ask you, do you think, right, that all I don't know, all might be too broad, but let's go with all mental illnesses, people can change, can become change?
I believe so. I think
Mm-hmm.
most times it's a delay of, if it's one that is developed, most times it's a delay of intervention. So you'd find like depression is continuously there because of trauma, and one may believe that they are so depressed that they become dependent on, medication and all those things. But if they are aware and they understand, the first way to help is to bring understanding. Now, there are people that are born, as they say, with particular mental health challenges. I do believe, based on my faith, right? This may be, someone else's so may have someone else may have a different opinion, but I believe because of my faith, I have seen and witnessed persons that were diagnosed and delivered, or they were diagnosed and they got help in addition to psychoeducation, biblical references, and spiritual help, where the diagnosis changed.
Yeah.
So I do believe in some instances that it's quite possible to reverse that diagnosis.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I was really asking that question because from my position as well in terms of faith, right?
Mhm.
I I find it strange for me to have a position. When I say I find it strange, I think it would be weird for me to have the position
Right.
that I believe in a God who could change things, but then not believe that diagnosis could change, right? That people whose brain
Correct.
might be fragmented can't like come back together, you know what I mean? Um,
Correct.
and so I love that there's also that element of faith. And as a
Yes.
Christian, right? And if there are Christians listening and so on, what are some of the things that you incorporate in terms of helping even with the emotional dysregulation and so on?
Um, Firstly, I like to bring in biblical stories.
Okay.
So you'll find, like, for example, the woman with the issue of blood who bled for 12 years. That was traumatic for her.
Mm-hmm.
The way she even pursued Jesus was a traumatic experience. But my favorite of all times is the woman at the well. It was a perfect example what therapy should look like, because Jesus spoke to the woman at the well without telling her her issue, even though he knew. And, it was simple by having conversation. He struck conversation. And then he said, "Well, let me see your husband." And she said, "The man that I'm with is not mine." He said, "I know." But he brought, and then he went on to say who he was by her further asking. And she said, "Are you the Messiah?" Whatnot. She became aware of who he was. And that was the beginning, or that was the part of her freedom. The beginning was the conversation at first. I say all this to say that there are times where I bring in the examples of the stories, but I also give practical steps like joining a community that prays and supports transparency, because there isn't always, not every question circle allows for that transparency.
Right.
And I remember, even in myself, when I was going through different seasons of my life where I was very much frustrated because I was struggling and I was in church and I couldn't say what I was struggling with because I was
Mm.
demonized. I was almost like a leper and I was frustrated. And I believe God had me to go through that so that I can be that support system or opportunity so persons can be transparent. So I always vouch and advocate for communities that allows you to be transparent while teaching truth.
Yeah.
I also believe an active prayer life, and if you can't pray alone, get a community or even one person that you're accountable to that can pray you through situations. I also believe getting assistance, example, a coach or a counselor, psychologist, whichever one that works for you based on the extremity of your trauma. Um, I believe in that. I believe in journaling. I'm a big advocate for journaling because
Mm-hmm.
what we don't realize is that emotions just need to be released.
Yeah.
And when those emotions are released, or you're able to express exactly how you feel without judgment on a piece of paper, you would not believe how much of a release that is. To those who are listening and you feel that you can't speak to anyone, get your paper and your pen. Get your paper and your pen and begin to write. All right. And so those are some practical ways. Affirmations. I believe in affirmations, not what the world has now created affirmations to be, but the first affirmation was I am that I am.
Yeah.
And so, God said it. And so, whoever we need him to be is who he becomes to us. So, if you need him to be a healer, you need him to be an advocate, you need him to be a silent listener in your conversation, he's there. So, I believe in acronyms and even declaring who you are, even though at the point in time during the traumatic experience or post traumatic experiences, that you can speak the word of God. It's truth. It doesn't change. It cannot change and it will not lie. Man can change the definition of who they perceive you to be today. Today you make a mistake and you're somebody else. But what the Bible says about you remains that it's a fact. It's not an opinion. It can change. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
those are some practical ways, affirmations, helping persons to even understand. So I do some psychoeducation sessions and I tie it in with the Bible, sharing stories, sharing principles, even scriptures that speaks about, God being close to the brokenhearted and things like that. So those are some of the strategies that I use.
Excellent. Yeah. And I like to say that I'm in the business of renewing minds, right?
Nice.
Um, from romance. And so I completely get that. And love it. I'm sure there are, of course, people who want that kind of help with, that the element of their faith. Because I do believe
Yes,
in taking care of that spiritual part of us first, we start to see how things transform, right?
for sure.
Good. And then you mentioned journaling, right? And so I feel like this would be a good time for you to share with us about your books, right? And
Ah,
how you can utilize those.
so I recently did in 2022 my healing journey journal, to
Mhm.
be just to give you a little background story of how that journal came about. Actually, I was on my deathbed on February 21st, 2021, and death came at my door. I was going through a very dark season because my mother would have passed away in 2020. It was in the climate of COVID. I became very ill. It was not COVID, but
Mhm.
I was just very, very ill, to the point where I was not breathing. I was rushed to the hospital. Um, I wasn't breathing for like 3 minutes. the doctor, I believe, was an angel that, did what he was not supposed to do, but I'm alive today. And he told me that he believed it was the Holy Spirit that told him to do exactly what he did, that I got out of that space of not breathing. Um, but that in that season, while I was recovering and going through the trauma of grief, my mom, how I lost my mom and so forth, I began to ask questions. And it's as if a lot of things from my childhood began to, come up. And I just started writing these questions, questions like, how does this impact you? Who have you become as a result of this incident or the incidents in your life? And these questions would just come in. This was 2021. And I had them there in my journal again. It was just written. And I remember one day the Lord said to me, I said, I want to do something for the people who will not go to a trauma coach or who will not go to therapy, who will not, but they need to release. And the Lord said, go to the questions. He said, that's the journal. And I began to put it together. And he said, heal as you write. And that was it. It became the Healing Journey Journal with the questions. So I say it's therapy in a book because it asks the questions a therapist may ask, and it allows you to write the hidden things that you may not want anybody to know if you're not prepared yet to face someone. So it's a journal that I created, and so far it has been impactful. For myself, I would have used it, and of course, I was the first guinea pig to use it to make sure that I'm putting something out there worthwhile. Then Fighting Your Goliaths is my very first book. It's somewhat an autobiography, a bit of my story, struggling with sexual immorality, how I overcame some of the things that came to me while I was, in that space of being bound by the things, where it came from. That was a part of the deliverance process for me, understanding where these things came from. um, it's a soul issue, deals a lot with understanding trauma, to be quite honest. It speaks a lot about how trauma can manifest itself in a spiritual way, keeping us bound by things that is not of God. And how, it is classified and categorized and how it interferes. One of the explanations I love, which was actually inspired by Apostle Ryan Lestrange, where he spoke of trauma being somewhat, or the results of trauma as someone who's a believer, that in the pipeline it's murky and dirty, and no one is seeing the pipeline. That's the trauma. But when the water comes out of the pipe, it's clear and no one sees the contamination. And sometimes we can minister or lead others through contamination because of trauma. And that was a really, really excellent explanation for me, because I was able to help others to understand what trauma can do. So we can look normal, operate normal, and we are dealing with some traumatic experiences, which is why we shy away from things, or we feel offended when people watch us, look at us a particular way, or no way at all. So it's a soul issue dealt with how to maintain when you go through your healing process and deliverance and recovery. And then we have the 7 days to make a difference. How that book came about, I always share inspirational stories on Facebook. And it was as a result of that, some of the things that I wrote, a journal came out, a devotional came out of it, 7 days. And that's it. I'm currently writing a book, Built to Bounce Back. It's on my recent traumatic event from my mother's death to migrating and having to come back home, and how it affected my entire family and so forth. So currently, that's what I'm writing right now. But those are my books. They can be found on Amazon right now. Locally, they are out of stock, but I will be stocked up soon. So that's generally about it where my books are concerned.
Excellent. I love that. And so there are a few different, because you I've written so many that you just kind of decide, hey, which one of these do I want to take in terms of understanding trauma a little bit more, right? You
Yeah.
could go to it's a soul issue, and then of course the healing
Journey
journal,
journal.
right?
Yeah.
My healing journey journal, that one for those persons who might feel hesitant right now to speak to a coach or a therapist, but want to start that, they want to start that process of healing, they can go towards the journal. And of course,
Yes.
to learn more about you, where you talk, even to be inspired, motivated, and encouraged, or even to become aware of post-traumatic growth, right? They could go
That's for
ahead
sure.
and read
Yes, I'm
your
an advocate for that because we hear a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder. We hear about a lot of post traumatic persons who are on medication and all these things. And I
right.
understand those things have a place, but I
Mm-hmm.
also don't hear enough of the post-traumatic growth, the new life experiences, the newness, the birthing of new things. There's so much that happens, post trauma. This is why a lot of organizations are formed for causes, domestic violence, all these things. There's new life, there's new opportunities, there's ways to bring hope to others as a result of post traumatic growth. And as you grow, you begin to appreciate the traumatic experiences you would have had because it's now tools to help not just build you up, but build others up.
Excellent. Great. And so for any listener who is in a position that you were in before your healing journey started, what is just one piece of advice that you would want to leave with them?
Two things I would like to say. One, you are not your trauma. Your trauma does not define you, it doesn't define anyone. And two, sometimes trauma causes us to make decisions and do things that are not pleasurable. You are not your mistake. And I want to say that because a lot of times we define ourselves by the mistakes we've made or the things we decided to do while the traumatized brain was active or is
Mhm.
active. Yeah. But that does not define you because in the midst of my vulnerability, in the midst of my promiscuity, in the midst of, being violent and fighting, and, trust me, I did some things. I knew inside I was a loving person. I knew inside that I cared. I knew inside that I wanted to be loved. I knew inside that I am a woman of value. And so, even though I made those mistakes, because, just some psychology here, the reptilian part of the brain that is loose, it runs because the thinking part of the brain shuts down with trauma. The reptilian part allows us to make impulsive things, decisions, or behave impulsively. So you don't necessarily blame yourself for sometimes giving into it because it happened, but there is grace, and there is hope, there's growth, and most importantly, it doesn't change who you are.
Yeah.
So I would like to say that to whoever is listening, and you
Yes.
could get help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
You'll be
that's true.
surprised. You're
Yes.
not the only person.
You're not the only, which is again another important point for people to be aware of. They're not the only, and like you were saying before, your trauma doesn't define you. Um, I think that that is important, and well, you don't have to become what happened to you, basically, right?
Exactly.
And even
Exactly.
like you mentioned, you might be behaving in a way that is out of alignment with your values,
Mm-hmm.
um, just because of that state. And so you don't define yourself by those actions, by your
Mm-hmm.
mistakes. And so
Yes.
that's wonderful. Great. And so in terms of how persons who are listening, if they want to be able to work with you, how can they reach you and how can the listeners support you? So you mentioned that your books are on Amazon, but in terms of your
Yes.
coaching and even the psychoeducation.
Definitely. You can get information on my website, www.sewglobal.biz. And there you have the coaching, the um, Christian counseling as well. Outside of that, if you need me to speak at any of your conferences, seminars, I offer that service. And I also offer personal and professional development training. One of the things I love to do is to introduce um, trauma into organizations, because a lot of times organizations are not aware of the impact trauma has on employees. And if employees are impacted by trauma, then productivity and profitability is in fact affected.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's one of the spaces I'm getting into right now, the corporate space, to help others to understand, how much it is important to begin to introduce a trauma-informed culture in organizations.
I like that. That
So
is definitely
www
not
dot
something you see. Yes.
Yes, www.sewglobal.biz. And if you are in Trinidad, you can reach me at 1868, or outside of Trinidad via WhatsApp, 1868-301-5885, 1868-301-5885.
Excellent. Any social media follow
Yes,
pages? Good.
yes, Summer_Edwards Williams. Summer_Edwards_Williams.
Mhm.
That is my personal page, but you could also get me on Christian_trauma__underscore coach,
Good.
right? You could get
Excellent.
me on that page as well.
Excellent. And we'll be sure to put it on the screen so that people will be able to see. So thank you so much, Mrs. Summer Edwards Williams, for joining us today. We appreciate it. And even in learning about trauma and to know that there's growth. We can have such new life after trauma.
Yes, I am a testimony. I'm a
Yes.
testimony. I really thank you and appreciate this interview. I pray that, as you continue to pursue and bring awareness to dynamic women in the Caribbean, may you be also recognized as a dynamic woman yourself and
Thank
walk
you.
in it. May the Lord bless you and keep you. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. And thank you so much. Take care.
The pleasure is mine. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.
Goodbye.